western street with eastern manners. Tall pagodas and golden banners throw their shadows through the lantern glow.
You can shop for precious jade or teakwood tables or silk brocade,
or see a bold and brassy nightclub show on the most exciting thoroughfare I know. Grant Avenue, San Francisco, California, USA, looks down from Chinatown over a foggy bay.
You travel there
In a trolley,
up you climb.
dong dong, you're in Hong Kong, having yourself a time.
The bustling neighborhood of Chinatown, San Francisco, with its pagodas and markets, witnessed the transitions that Chinese immigrants had to go through to fit in with American society. San Francisco's Chinatown, in the mid-1800s to early 1900s, metamorphosed Chinese immigrant stereotypes through the negative propaganda caused by the 1882 Exclusion Act and Yellow Slavery, inspiring Chinese immigrants to fight against the harmful ideologies. The first major wave of Chinese immigration started in the 1800s, with immigrants coming to the United States for better work opportunities. Many of these immigrants came to San Francisco, California, and went to become laborers. Many American companies exploited these immigrants by paying cheaply for their labor. Some immigrants became farmhands or went to the factories that were booming from the Industrial Revolution. But the majority of the Chinese immigrants went to work on building the Central Pacific and Transcontinental Railroads. According to an article by Stanford News, there are an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese migrants who laid the tracks of the western half of the railroad. These migrants had to face the extremely dangerous work conditions of the elements and the mountains and were still paid less than white workers. Yet they persevered and were some of the best workers while building the railroads. And because of this, Chinese immigrants were given a stereotype of being excellent workers. However, this positive stereotype quickly turned into a negative one. This was mainly due to the Civil War ending, plus an easier way to travel west thanks to the railroad, meaning jobs were more scarce. Suddenly, the once praised Chinese workers became a threat for young Americans. American families were afraid that their sons would be unable to secure jobs when there were excellent workers available with a cheaper price tag. So, after the railroads were finished, the majority of the immigrants came to live in San Francisco, cultivating a neighborhood that brought the old country, China, to the new country, America. This political cartoon, What Shall We Do With Our Boys, is drawn to show Chinese immigrants stealing Americans' jobs. This cartoon shows the belief that American men are above being factory workers and that Chinese immigrants are taking the more prestigious jobs. By depicting the Chinese immigrants as disgusting work monsters but Americans as young men, Keller is able to create a reputation for Chinese immigrants essentially taking over the American workforce, something that a lot of people felt should only include Americans. Committees sprung up around Chinatown, printing things such as Chinatown Declared a Nuisance, which was printed by the Workmen's Committee of California in 1880. The 16-page pamphlet is full of anti-Chinese sentiments such as, "We have in the center of San Francisco an alien population, dangerous to the health, morals, and prosperity of our city, and threatening, unless efficient measures are enforced, to destroy the value of our property, imperil the health of our citizens." Since Chinese immigrants posed as a threat to the American workers, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act provided a means to limit the entry of immigrants. While the act claimed to only limit the entry of laborers, it was twisted to restrict almost all Chinese immigrants, along with Chinese people who were born in America. A notable case was Wong Kim Ark versus the Supreme Court. Wong Kim Ark was a legal American citizen but was denied re-entry to the United States when he came back from a trip to China. He was born in Chinatown, San Francisco, hence his citizenship. But the Collector of Customs, John Wise, refused to acknowledge Wong's citizenship regardless of numerous official documents. According to the Smithsonian Magazine, if birthright children of Chinese ancestry and their children in turn were no longer considered citizens, they would lose their legal standing to re-enter the U.S. after traveling abroad unless they belonged to one of the other exempted classes. This is just one example of how the Exclusion Act forced Chinatown into a prison for Chinese immigrants living there. If they left America, they would not be allowed back if they were not citizens. Even if they were citizens but their parents were not citizens, they could be heavily questioned and even deported. Along with negative propaganda, there was a growing business in opium smuggling along with yellow slavery, with Chinese immigrants being restricted from actual actual jobs, they had to create jobs themselves to scrape by. One of the ways was smuggling opium, an addictive drug, into America from China and creating opium dens. Opium was used by the press as another way to prove that the Chinese were leaving a bleak mark in America. With opium smuggling, there was also human smuggling. Yellow slavery essentially forced Chinese immigrant women into prostitution. Smithsonian Magazine writes, those women were literally sold at auction in the 1860s and the 1870s on the wharf of San Francisco. There was a general stigma towards Chinese immigrants because of this massive sex slavery that was found in Chinatown. Majority of the women that lived in Chinatown were forced into prostitution as they were brought to the United States from China thinking that they would become wives. The 1882 Exclusion Act, negative propaganda, yellow slavery, and opium dens were all attempts to push the Chinese immigrants out of Chinatown. However, the Chinese, despite the major setbacks, were able to completely reinvent their image in Chinatown as a whole. One of the counterattacks that Chinese immigrants used to fight against the negative propaganda surrounding them was the creation of the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, or the CCBA. The CCBA has been a recognized organization since 1882 and has been helping Chinese immigrants ever since. It has offered help in many ways, such as finding jobs, housing, along with financially supporting the Chinatown inhabitants. Previous to the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, the Occidental Board Presbyterian Mission House served as a safe haven for women that escaped yellow slavery. Founded in 1874, the Mission House was created to help women learn basic life skills to support themselves and to potentially find husbands. Along with teaching women how to survive by themselves, the Mission House also stood by the trafficked women when they spoke out against the men that forced them into yellow slavery. Some of the first Chinese women to go down in American history spent time in the Occidental Board Presbyterian Mission House. Bessie Jiang was one of the first Chinese women to graduate from Stanford University with a bachelor's degree in biology, and later made history again when she became one of the first female Chinese physicians in America. Another notable woman from the Mission House is Tai Liang Shuozi, the first Chinese woman to vote, along with being the first to pass the civil service exams, earning her a job with the government. She became a translator at the Angel Island Immigration Station. The most monumental effect of the Mission House was a sense of feminism. The Mission House was women helping women, regardless of race. The white women who founded the house were barely allowed in public, much less allowed to vote. Yet they still used their resources to help Asian women who were in even worse situations than the founders. Furthermore, this partnership would launch many success stories for Chinese immigrants and women as a whole. Even though the actual image of Chinese immigrants started to improve as Chinatown got older, immigrants still had an unyielding blockade to physically get to America. Technically, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act expired in 1892, but it was reinvented in the Geary Act. The Geary Act required Chinese students to register for a certificate of residence, along with the previous requirements. While the actual entry process into America had very few improvements, the treatment of the Chinese immigrants changed drastically. Largely due to the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, Chinatown was given the opportunity to rebuild its buildings and its image. Seizing this opportunity, the inhabitants of Chinatown decided to rebuild Chinatown too.
But it's to communicate to the viewer that Chinatown was a theme park worthy of visitation.
By cementing the idea that Chinatown was a part of America, yet also a part of China, gave Americans a sense of curiosity, which is how Chinatown boomed with business. Americans, instead of finding Chinese products unnatural, realized that their products and goods were exotic. Of course, Chinatown had to water down a lot of their culture, such as their cuisine, but by doing so, Chinese immigrants were able to fully become Chinese Americans. They let go of part of the old country and replaced it with the new country. In the mid-1800s to early 1900s, Chinatown, San Francisco endured cynical stereotypes, yellow slavery, along with numerous acts that further alienated Chinese immigrants. However, because of these hardships, Chinatown pushed to reinvent its image and cemented itself as an American tourist destination, along as a new home for those leaving China. With the help of associations such as the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association and the Occidental Board Presbyterian Mission House, Chinese immigrants slowly became Chinese Americans and eventually Americans. Without the backdrop of Chinatown, many of these success stories would not exist in history, and that is the beauty of Chinatown.